there is, as you know, especially under the old school regime of the guidelines when downward departures were probably more significant than they are now, but we have variances, but the diminished capacity is a sentencing mitigation argument. And to say that because of a mental disease or defect, I committed this crime, that makes people less culpable. I know people want to look at this guy and think he's the devil and this was the worst thing in the world and it was a horrible offense. But if you're committing an offense because you are mentally ill, that is mitigation. When we talk about, oh, I represent people at sentencing and I'm trying to get them less time, and like, oh, you're trying to get them off the hook. No, I'm trying to make the punishment fit the person,
Right.
not just the crime.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing.
Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's a rainy Saturday morning and I am here again with my good friend and colleague, Mark Allenbaugh. Good morning, Mr. Allenbaugh. How are you?
Good morning, Mr. Passon. I'm doing quite well. Thank you.
We are here today to talk about the recent conviction of a gentleman by the name of David DePape, who you probably know was just convicted in federal court involving the awful attack on Paul Pelosi from several months back, where he broke into the Pelosi's home in San Francisco. He was looking for Nancy Pelosi to do all kinds of crazy things, and he got basically caught red-handed and did some really horrible stuff. And he's being prosecuted in the state and the federal courts separately, but the Fed trial went first. And so we want to talk about that today, mostly about what he was convicted of, and of course, what the sentencing implications are here, and some other interesting issues. So I guess we just have to dig in right now. Give us a rundown, Mark, of how this case ends up in federal court. What are the federal charges, and what's the kind of meat and
Meat and potatoes.
meat and potatoes of the defense they tried to make?
So this is an interesting case because at the federal level, we do not see very often violent offenses. Violent offenses generally are prosecuted by the state. So, and there's no common law at the federal level. It is all statutory. So there only a few statutes actually define what could constitute a federal violent offense. And those generally involve either something that happens on federal property, like J6, the January 6th insurrection, or if you've attacked a federal official, or in this case, a family member. And that's basically how the federal jurisdiction got into play. DePape had, what he was convicted of doing was breaking into Nancy and Paul Pelosi's home in San Francisco, which is not federal property. And he was apparently looking for Nancy Pelosi and wanted to kidnap her. Paul Pelosi encountered him because there was some video of him DePape breaking into their backyard, or a door through their backyard. And once he got in, Paul Pelosi, who is in his 80s, confronted DePape and tried to de-escalate the situation. And actually, I think he was pretty good, fairly successful at de-escalating the situation, was able to call the police. And the police showed up, and that's when all hell broke loose. The police were at the front door, and probably many of the viewers have seen this. There was some body cam footage from one of the police officers that had responded. And as they're standing at the door, they could see Paul Pelosi and DePape both holding a hammer. They weren't really struggling. They're just standing there holding it. and the police are commanding them to let go of the hammer, let it drop to the ground. And all of a sudden, DePape just grabs the hammer away from Pelosi and strikes him right there on his head, which, lucky didn't kill him. And that was all captured on the body cam footage. And so how did we get into federal court here? Because two things. One is the intent that DePape had to kidnap a federal official, namely Nancy Pelosi, who was then the Speaker of the House and third in line to the presidency, or second in line, I guess, technically second in line to the presidency. And also the fact that he attacked a close family member also was evidence that he was trying to, that his conduct constituted an action against a federal official, Nancy Pelosi attacking her husband and all this other stuff. So that's basically it. That's what made it a federal offense.
Yeah.
That he intended to attack a federal official and did in fact attack a federal official's spouse.
And by the way, so in terms of violent offenses,
Yeah.
just a total like non sequitur and not relevant to this at all, but I was a federal defender for a dozen years here in Arizona, and I actually had a ton of violent offenses on my caseload because the only other time we see violent offenses in the federal system are crimes committed on the Indian reservations.
Yes.
And of course, we have a bunch of them here in Arizona. So all the violent crimes, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, murders, attempted murder, sexual offenses, vehicular homicides, all coming off the reservation. But yeah, other than that, it looks like a really small percentage of the federal caseload nationwide. Yeah.
So can I share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
So here, this is the verdict form that came down, I think, 2 days ago, showing that he was found guilty of 2 counts, 1 count of attempted kidnapping, and the other count of attempted kidnapping was of Nancy Pelosi, and the assault was of Paul Pelosi, her husband. And as far as how rare kidnapping is prosecuted under 2A 4.1. And we can see all of last year, out of the 60-something thousand federal cases, only 120 were sentenced under the kidnapping guideline. And that was 0.2% of the entire federal caseload. So it is very rare to see cases like this.
So, and just so I from the facts of this case,
Yeah.
because I think that it bears noting, like what's his motivation and to kidnap Nancy Pelosi. So, he's a dude who apparently is deep into QAnon
Yes.
conspiracy, and there's, I guess people know this, but I don't know if people know how wacky this is, but there's so much garbage online about this conspiracy theory, and it alleges the highest upper echelon of our political system, and of course, like Hollywood celebrities. There's a huge anti-Semitic strain running through this, which is obviously very relevant to everything that's happening today. But he's convinced that there's this cabal of pedophiles and all these people that are trying to do all this terrible, terrible stuff. And he wasn't just targeting Pelosi; he was targeting Hunter Biden.
Yeah.
He was Adam Schiff, Gavin Newsom, the governor, and of course Tom Hanks, because everyone knows he's a baby eating pedophile. And so he apparently just wholeheartedly believed in these delusional online conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And his goal, I guess he had an inflatable unicorn costume so he's going to break in, kidnap Nancy wearing an inflatable unicorn costume, and I guess tie her up and interrogate her so that she confesses and gives up all the information about this conspiracy theory. And if she wasn't going to answer him correctly, apparently he was going to smash her kneecaps with the hammer. That's his plan.
And he was going to live stream all of this.
live stream all of this, and in his mind, which he's going into trial not saying, boy, that was crazy, I'm really sorry. He went into trial saying, I wholeheartedly believe this to this day, and I wholeheartedly believe that, my actions were justified because I'm saving the country. But that wasn't his defense. What was his defense?
Well, it was his defense was that it was a technical one, that this wasn't a federal offense because he wasn't targeting Nancy Pelosi in her official capacity as Speaker of the House. We're trying to influence the government, but it was more that he was interested in revealing this cabal of pedophiles and whatnot. But to me, as we've spoken offline, I think that's cutting it too close, too cute by half, as we've said in the past. And obviously the jury didn't buy that distinction, and that I still can't really wrap my head around if that's a distinction with any difference. But his that's what his defense strategy was to try to show it wasn't a federal offense.
And presumably, I mean, if assuming the insane theory was true, presumably Nancy Pelosi knows all this because she's the Speaker.
Exactly.
She's a very powerful person.
Right.
But I don't know. It could have. I guess it could. He could have just as easily done this to Tom Hanks, God forbid, and it wouldn't have been a federal.
That would not have been a federal offense.
But it kind of doesn't explain why he felt compelled to beat Paul Pelosi in the head with a hammer, just at random.
Right.
So I don't know, but
that might come out. That might come out at for sentencing as a mitigating factor. Maybe he was. It was a spur of the moment thing. He had contemplated it, and he was just scared. All of a sudden the police are there and everything's going sideways, and he wasn't expecting it. I don't know. I mean, that's probably not much mitigation as it is, but they're going to have their it's going to be a difficult sentencing for them.
You set a great stage for a mitigation conversation, which I definitely want to have. Because of course I have some thoughts on that, but I figure before we get there, let's talk about guidelines. Because here's the crazy thing. I think it's just, we always talk about the guidelines as the drunk uncle, like we're always relying on this advice that the guideline gives. But in this case, I think and tell me if I'm wrong, but the kidnap guideline is higher than the assault guideline.
Oh yeah, much higher.
Much higher. And if you think about it, and just in terms of raw harm caused by actions, you have almost killing someone by hitting them in the head with a hammer, which is less serious under the guidelines than attempting to he didn't even kidnap anyone, but it's the attempt kidnap. There's no distinction between attempting to commit a crime and completing a crime. So that
at the federal level,
you show us that. Tell us that. I mean, just to set that up, how kooky that is.
Here's the guidelines calculation under 2A1 or 4.1, which is again the kidnapping guidelines. So he's going to start at a really high base offense level of 32. He's going to get a +6 for a demand on the government. And again, even though this may not have been proven, arguably, I think it was proven, but let's even assuming that his attempted kidnapping really wasn't a demand on the government per se. Just assume that for a second. If that wasn't proven at trial, that's really irrelevant for sentencing purposes, because at sentencing now, all that factor only needs to be proven by a preponderance of the evidence, and any type of evidence, even otherwise inadmissible evidence, can be used. So that there was a demand on the government, and what was the demand? Well, reveal yourself, Nancy Pelosi and everybody else, and part of this big cabal. So that's
now. By the way, that's one of those things where we talked a million times about how easy it is to prove these because they're only preponderance. But in the Ninth Circuit, there is some of that law that says if it's a very significant increase in the guidelines, they might be able to argue for a higher burden of proof. And 6, I don't remember exactly. I don't have the case law in front of me, but 6 is a huge bump. You don't see a 6-level bump that often unless you're talking about loss amounts and things like that. So I'd be interested to know if you could at least argue that convicted? Because isn't that the crux of his defense was I didn't do this because of, well, now that I think about it, he's already been convicted of that.
He's already been convicted. So I think this is going to be kind of a foregone conclusion. But if you jump ahead, you can see what the total is at a 49, even taking a 6 off is not going to change his guidelines. So
he's off the charts.
He's off the chart. So he's
literally off the charts.
Literally, because he's going to also get a +4 for life-threatening bodily injury. So now we're at 42. Then he's going to get a +2 for a dangerous weapon, the hammer. So now we're at 44. He's going to get an enhancement for vulnerable victim, and a vulnerable victim needs to be a victim that's especially vulnerable. Well, this victim was, an 80-year-old man asleep in his home. And I think that's going to be pretty easy to apply that. He was especially vulnerable. He was completely defenseless and elderly. And then there's actually, and this I just discovered this morning when I was doing the calculations, I was not aware that there's a +3 level enhancement for harming an immediate family member of a government official. And that's at 3A1.2A1C, if anybody wants to look it up. And I also think, even though this is gilding the lily, but I know prosecutors like to do that, he is also eligible for the terrorism enhancement because his conduct was politically motivated, all of this. Now, he's not eligible for the actual terrorism adjustment because, oddly enough, kidnapping a federal official doesn't constitute a federal crime of terrorism. Federal crime of terrorism has to be, an act that you do with a political motive, but it also has to be one of an enumerated offense under 18 U.S.C. 2332B G5. So what?
Okay.
Yeah. So at any rate, it's not, for whatever reason, there's attempted murder, a whole bunch of other stuff. Even computer offenses against the government can be constituted federal crime of terrorism, but for whatever reason, Congress never listed kidnapping. So at any rate, so he could get an upward departure. It would be eligible for that too. But as you can see, his adjusted offense level is at a 49, and of course, he's not getting a -3 for acceptance since he went to trial. Right. So 43 is the top of the chart, and as we know, what the guidelines say is, in those rare cases like this one where you're off the charts, then you just chop it back down to 43, which is life. And because the statute of conviction here provides for a life sentence, that's what his guideline range will be, is life.
Yeah. And that's not even taking into account whether he has criminal history.
That's not taking into account criminal history.
Wouldn't matter, because you can't dress up that turd anymore. Like, it's life is life. And there's no Zippo, obviously. Even if he had no criminal history, the 0-point offender wouldn't apply, because
violent offense,
crime of violence. So he is in really, really, really bad shape. Like, of all the podcasts we've done, of all the high profile cases that we've analyzed, I think this is by far the worst one we've seen so far. And I think both of us are on the very same page as far as outcome. It would be very easy to give him a life sentence.
Yes. And so
of course, go. I'm sure you're going to the same place I want to go, but even if he got less than quote unquote life, the term of years he'd be looking at, because I know you're going to tell us about life expectancy, but even if he gets less than an actual life sentence, he's probably still going to get a life sentence.
Oh, he's going to get a de facto life sentence. But where actually I was going to go before I went to life expectancy is, let's see some statistics. I went to Jason and the Judiciary Sentencing Information Platform, which many districts, it's still in this 2-year testing period, but there's about 35 district courts throughout the United States now that regularly have their probation officers run a Jason analysis and put it in the PSR. And if you happen to be in one of those districts that are where they're doing the Jason stuff, you should contact us. because there's a lot of problems with Jason.
Mhm.
There's a lot of
so first of all, Mark at sentencingstats.com knows this stuff backwards and forwards better than anyone on the planet, I might argue. But we did a whole podcast on Jason, and Jason's an interesting and useful tool, but it is flawed, and we talk about some of those things. So I should put that podcast in the show notes. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No. So as what Jason tells us is, over the last 5 fiscal years, there were 16 defendants whose primary guideline was 2A 4.1, had a final offense level of 43 in criminal history category 1. And I'm just assuming he's a 1. And that's excluding anybody who received a 5K, which I doubt there was anybody that had a 5K for this. So for all those 16 defendants, the average sentence was 350 months. And the median sentence, 350 months is almost 30 years, almost 30 years. And the median sentence imposed was 403 months, which is a very, 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 very long time. So yes, excuse me, even though they got less than life, they're still got sentences so long that they will be de facto life sentences, or as I call it, death by prison. But let's look at his life expectancy though. So DePape is 43 years old, born in 1980. And according to the Social Security Administration, his life expectancy as of today is 81.7 years. I mean, he was expected to live to be 81.7. That doesn't take into account the
Patterson study.
Yeah, it doesn't take into account the deleterious effects of prison on someone's life expectancy. And that's where the Patterson study comes in. Dr. Evelyn Patterson, he did a study that has been widely cited both in federal court and several state Supreme Courts as persuasive authority regarding the impact on life expectancy on inmates. And what she found was that on average, an inmate can expect to lose 2 years off of his life expectancy for every year of incarceration. So applying that to DePape, he's at 42, he's not going to live to be 81.7. As what this chart shows is that basically he has about 13 years or about 12 years left. 13 years from when he was first incarcerated. He was first incarcerated when he was arrested in 2022, in October of 2022, when he committed the offense. He's been in continuous custody since then, and he's going to remain in custody. Yeah. But according to the Patterson study, statistically, he's only going to survive until about 2035, or about another 12 years. So any sentence over that is effectively over 13 years is death by prison.
Well, and this is probably a good place to note too, because of the Patterson study is really about, the conditions of confinement and the toll that it takes on our body and our mind and our soul. And that's why it reduces the life expectancy. But a lot of times when we're doing these podcasts, we're talking about white collar offenses where someone's going to go to a much less restrictive environment we call a camp. Now, we know that many camps in the BOP are horrible and despicable, and we've done podcasts on that too. But
Mr. Just on that note, just before I forget, sorry to interrupt, Doug.
Yeah.
But I think we need to do another podcast on terminology and get the BOP to change the terminology of camp, because it is so completely misleading.
Yeah. Well, what would we call it?
Open warfare.
Yeah, it's no secret. The secret is out. The secret is out among us and some of the defense bar. But what we really need to do is make sure judges understand how awful some of these camps are, because I think they think, I'm going to give them this time, but it's not going to be that hard. It's hard.
Yes.
And I just saw a letter that went to President Biden about Pensacola, which used to be the crown jewel. The camp there used to be the crown jewel of the BOP, and it is a shit show, epic disaster. And of course, you and I have been dealing with Petersburg, which we just submitted a whistleblower affidavit from a former psychologist who worked there, who confirmed every bad thing our clients are telling us about that place. The BOP is an utter shit show. Yeah. So camp is a bullshit term.
Yes.
I went to camp. It's lovely. not a camp. I went to summer camp.
Yeah.
And this is no camp. This is
Yeah.
no camp.
Yeah.
But anyway, DePape's not going to a camp.
No.
Where's DePape? Probably ain't
Well,
going.
I think because of his notoriety and the violent nature of his offense, and I'm sure some of our friends, former wardens and former BOP officials that we work with, may have obviously would have better insight. But my guess is he's going to go to a high security facility, to a USP or a US prison. I don't think he's going to go to the AdMax out in Florence, but he will go to, given the length of his sentence, the violent nature, and the notoriety. And he may have obviously some violent issues too, and we're going to learn more about this as sentencing progresses. But he most likely will be designated to a USP, and my guess would be the USP down in Victorville, California, because that's the closest USP to the Northern District of California where he was sentenced.
Well, and by the way, I mean, he still has state prosecution pending. Right. So the question is, where is he gonna serve his sentence, in the state or the federal? If he gets convicted in the state, of course, presumption of innocence.
Right.
But I think maybe, because I noticed this was pretty quick. This case went to trial pretty fast.
Yes.
And I almost wonder if that was deliberate, because if I'm not mistaken, it's like first in, if the BOP has custody of him now, or the feds have custody of him now, he probably does go serve his time federally.
Yes, he's going to serve his time federally, and his public defenders were wise to push this quick. Otherwise, he'd be sitting in a, what is the name of the prison there in San Francisco? There's a big notorious state prison, San Quentin. San Quentin. Yeah, it's probably where he would go and serve his time there. That's bad.
Yeah, so
even worse.
So as much as we like to bitch about the BOP, I think I'm taking the BOP over San Quentin or Soledad or any of those. Yeah.
So let's take a look at Victorville, though, because it's probably not that much better than San Quentin. This is the I track the population of all the BOP facilities, all 189 of them, weekly. And also I do have access to all the design capacity, and actually this should be rated capacity. The PREA, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act, that's considered the design capacity and also the rated capacity. So excuse the typo there. But in any case, both the design and rated capacity for USP Lompoc is 960 inmates. And as we can see, Lompoc has been consistently over capacity, and over the last several months has been growing in population. It's been over capacity for the last 3 years, and now it's at a record high, at least as of over the last 3 years. So he's going to go into an overcrowded, high security facility with other very dangerous inmates. It's not going to be a good time for him. It might not be better. Frankly, I'm not sure if it's better than San Quentin, but generally BOP facilities are better than state facilities. But in this case, I think he's screwed either way.
Pelican Bay, I think, is another California state facility that's pretty notorious for being horrible too. So I just don't. I think any way you cut it, he's not going anywhere that's going to be easy time. Right. And I'm sure there's plenty of people here that that think that's fine. But here's my thing. Oh, do you have more?
No, that's it.
All right. So here's why I think this is where I get put on my bleeding heart defense lawyer cap and my armchair psychological diagnosis cap. But here's why I'm looking at this case. And the takeaway is our job is really, really hard as defense lawyers, because in my mind, and maybe I'm delusional, I don't know, but I'm sort of playing out how this defense it sort of unfolds and what's happening here. And if you look at the facts objectively on their face, this is nutty. That's my clinical term. This is delusional thinking. And so the question becomes whether it's just is there a real psychological diagnosis behind this delusional thinking, or is this just a product of the political climate, that
Yeah,
this sort of all the mistrust, laying the foundation for the onslaught of misinformation, using that as political propaganda, and then somebody just goes down a rabbit hole and just believes it in their heart of hearts. So does that make them crazy? No. But then it's one thing to believe that, but then another thing to say, I'm going to bring a blow up unicorn corn costume and break into somebody's home and beat someone with a hammer on their kneecaps. Like
yeah.
that's it,
That
that
doesn't seem rational at all.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think it takes a professional to look at this objectively and say this man is suffering from mental illness. And if you read about it online, there's other things going on. If you if it's true. So the point is, why isn't this raised? Because I looked at the docket and there's no competency
Right.
evaluation and everything else. So, for example, I handled a case several years ago, and the client took over a National Labor Relations Board hearing. Like he walked in the middle of a hearing with guns and ammunition and took the whole place hostage. And he did it because he believed there was this massive conspiracy against him and his wife. And he was diagnosed with delusional disorder. And it was so obvious on its face, just by the nature of the offense, that there was this issue. And that case could never go to trial because he was found incompetent to stand
Right.
trial. Because when you have a real mental disorder or whatever, you either have to be found competent or restored to competency, maybe through medication, things like that. And so he'll never, I mean, he got committed he's still in the Bureau of Prisons, but he's there because of his mental
Yeah.
situation. And he's not in a terrible place like Victorville. He's in a hospital facility, prison hospital facility.
Yeah.
The point
Well,
is,
yeah.
yeah,
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm just wondering, what is this? You can only speculate. So this is all just armchair speculation, but I'm looking at the docket. There's no motion to determine competency. There's no notice of an insanity defense. There's not a whiff, not a scent, not a hint that David DePape has a mental disorder and that would be somehow relevant to his case.
Yeah.
And the question is why?
Well, because I think if reading in between the lines, and maybe not too much, but I think the strategy was, rather than going that route to try to escape liability for the offense, the bigger issue was just to keep him out of federal court. I think that's what the strategy was, to prove. That's why they put him up on the stand too, which is something you never do, especially if your client happens to be exhibiting some delusions, and may have a delusional disorder, but they put him up on the stand. But I think the purpose was to demonstrate or to prove that this was not a federal offense because he did not have the required mens rea to commit it. But
Right.
Obviously that, although that failed, I mean, they still have a right to an appeal, and maybe they might be able to get some relief at the appellate level.
So and that's exactly right. But you could have done either or. You could have mounted both, which
Right.
is to say, jurisdictionally, that's the easy. I mean, that has nothing to do with him. But here's what I think has to be going on. The lawyers have to have this conversation with the client to say, we think it would be a good idea to maybe undertake a psychological evaluation and mount this as a defense. But here's the pernicious thing about delusional disorder. Again, I'm no psychologist, I'm no psychiatrist, but I've had enough experience with this. So the delusions are so fixed that it's damn near impossible to shake somebody off of their delusion, because the pernicious thing about delusional disorder versus schizophrenia is, like, schizophrenia, the delusions are so far-fetched that they could almost never be real. Like aliens have implanted chips in my brain,
Right.
and I could prove there's no chip in your brain, but delusionals are, these things in our lifetime, I mean, they could be true, that there's rings of pedophiles and everything. It's not true, but it's possible within the realm of reality that these things could actually happen. And
They
so
point to like
there's
Jeffrey Epstein and stuff like that.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so But the other pernicious thing is when you have delusional disorder, you have no conception that you have an illness. It's
Right.
everybody else that's ill. So if the
Or
client
naive.
isn't, yeah, if the client isn't going to be agreeable, amenable to pursuing that kind of defense, you're sort of hamstrung
Right.
as a lawyer. And I guarantee you these I don't guarantee you, but I speculate that these lawyers really wanted to pursue the competency
Mhm.
issues. And, even though the insanity defense is darn near impossible to win because it's been gutted, there's still an insanity defense here. Doesn't mean he would go free. He'd
Right.
probably be committed civilly for his mental disease for many years to come, but it just didn't happen. And
Yeah.
and I have to imagine that that's not because the defense lawyers didn't think it
Right.
was a good idea. It was because we have a hard job.
Yeah.
And it's never harder when it comes to defending a client who has mental illness.
So let me ask you this though, Doug. Let's say now at sentencing, he finally relents. He sees the writing on the wall. Like, look, I don't want to spend the rest of my life in prison, and he now consents to get psychologically evaluated. And again, here I'm assuming that he resisted that, and that's why that wasn't introduced at trial.
Yeah.
Well, so what? How does one use that at sentencing? Look, my client was not incompetent to stand trial, but he was suffering from a delusion. He still has some kind of delusional disorder, something like that. How does one use that at sentencing?
Well, there's a
How would
there's
you
a
use it
rec
here? I guess is the
well,
better question. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there is, as you know, especially under the old school regime of the guidelines when downward departures were probably more significant than they are now, but we have variances. But the diminished capacity is a sentencing mitigation argument, and to say that because of a mental disease or defect, I committed this crime, that makes people less culpable. I know people want to look at this guy and think he's the devil and this was the worst thing in the world and it was a horrible offense. But if you're committing an offense because you are mentally ill, that is mitigation. And it's quintessentially like people, say, how do you defend those people, and well, when aren't you trying, when we talk about, oh, I represent people at sentencing and I'm trying to get them less time, and like, oh, you're trying to get them off the hook. No, I'm trying to make the punishment fit the person,
Right.
not just the crime. Because
Right.
if you just look like objectively at the crime, yeah, this is horrible and could have killed somebody and it's just terrible. But you don't just look at the crime, you have to look at the person. And if you can present credible evidence that he's mentally ill and that illness is directly tied to the reason he commits this crime, then hell yeah, it's mitigating. Absolutely. And I mean, it remains to be seen. We're going to have to do a follow-up, after sentencing to see what happens.
Yeah.
Now,
Well, the problem, yes, it's mitigating in the sense of, maybe he doesn't deserve as much prison time, but he is going to do a significant amount of prison time, even if, even if he only gets, let's say, 13 years, that's still going to be a significant amount of time. As you and I well know, it is beyond the BOP's capacity to provide adequate mental health care to the inmates. And so knowing that, and that's undisputed, that, I mean, even the OIG has written several articles or several reports about that to Congress, just about how dysfunctional the BOP is, especially when it comes to health care and mental health care. So how can that be used? That fact, like, look, okay, my client has mental health issues. Yes, it's a mitigating factor, but obviously, Judge, we know you're going to give him some time. But without adequate mental health care, even that little bit of time may exacerbate his the problems with his mental health and stuff like that.
Well, there's two different tracks for that argument, I think. The first is if he's not diagnosed or has any cognizance of his own illness, and this is simply just still on the back burner. Because what happens there is he won't be asking for mental health treatment. Therefore, the BOP, even if they could provide it, I don't think they will. But what's going to happen is he's going to be treated simply as a discipline problem. So
Mhm.
all of his impulsivity, his outbursts, his crazy, ramblings, whatever it is, are just going to be causing him daily, you know, his he'll spend a lot of time in solitary
Yeah.
confinement because he's going to be in trouble all the time.
Yeah, he's gonna be in trouble all the time. He's gonna be in solitary all the time, and he's gonna go even more mad.
Yeah. And so that I
So it's
think
just,
that's
it's
one
not just,
argument to the
yeah,
judge. Like
yeah,
there's no
yeah,
help for him, and every day is going to be an exponentially more difficult prison
yeah.
sentence for him because he has no awareness of his own mental illness. Yeah,
You,
and
you know,
so
and it
the
was just interesting. I'm sorry, just a
yeah.
quick note is I
Mhm.
think it was earlier this week that the Supreme Court denied cert in a case. There was an inmate had brought habeas regarding his conditions of confinement, suffered from mental illness, acted out a lot, was constantly being disciplined. One of the disciplinary measures was denying him yard time. And
Mm.
generally, the inmates, this was I think an Illinois state prison, they were getting an hour of exercise each day. He had not been out of his cell in 3 years.
Oh my God.
In 3 years. And the Supreme Court just decided to punt on that. There were three
Ugh.
dissents. There were three dissents at least, and that was the liberal wing, and I think it was
Yeah.
either Justice Sotomayor or Jackson had written the dissent. But
Ugh,
so
it's
that's
horrible.
the point is that shit happens, and so it's not
Yeah.
even death by prison, it's torture by prison first, and then death by prison. And of course,
Yeah.
I know I already hear people out there saying, "Good, fine, that's what he
Yeah.
deserves." But
Yeah.
that's not what
But
our prison system is about.
yeah, and so yeah, and just FYI, like if he was, so we know in regular facilities the mental health care is virtually non-existent. It's
Right.
abysmal.
Yes.
It's shockingly offensive. But if he could develop this and get a diagnosis and end up in a prison
Right.
like a federal
FMC.
FMC, a federal
Yeah.
medical facility, he actually would get pretty meaningful mental health
Yeah.
treatment, and the
Yeah.
conditions of confinement would be somewhat more tolerable, I
Yeah.
think. And the other thing is that the BOP even if he didn't get a life sentence, the BOP sort of has the power to keep him. This is the pernicious part. I did a podcast on this too, but if they think you're a danger because of your mental illness, once your sentence is up, they can file civil commitment and keep you there.
John
And
Hinckley Jr.
yeah, I mean, even this client that I talked about who took the NLRB courtroom hostage, that was more than 20 years ago, I think, that I handled that case, and he's never been tried. This is horrible, but
Wow.
he's never been tried. He's never been convicted, and he's still in the the FMC. He's still incarcerated. So it's the point is, if you do argue these mental health things, it's not like we're saying, oh, that's going to get him out and it's going to
Right.
be fine. No, it just means that he's going to be treated as a human being a little bit. He has a little bit more chance of being treated as a human
Yeah.
being than a monster or an animal,
Right.
which is what the BOP and many prisons are famous for doing.
Yeah.
So I guess it remains to be seen whether any of this is gonna come up as mitigation at sentencing. It's a whole other ethical thing whether the lawyers can raise it themselves based on what they know, or whether
Right.
they need actual permission from their client. Because my guess is the client wouldn't have it, wouldn't want it.
Yeah. Right.
And
Yeah.
the only other thing is, if assuming it's not a mental health issue and it's just this crazy conspiracy theory, I've had other cases where, for example, the Michigan militia, the plot to kidnap the governor, which is
Mm.
very similar to this crime, although no one got hurt, thank goodness. But in that case, there was a very powerful mitigation theme of how people get radicalized online.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if a person can wake up from that and realize how they've been radicalized and how wrong their views were, and express an appropriate level of remorse, that's a massive, mitigation argument. I don't think we're going to get there in this case, not even
Yeah.
close, unfortunately. So bad times ahead for Mr. DePape.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess stay tuned. We'll do it. We'll do a chapter 2 after sentencing. I don't even know if there's a sentencing date set. I was looking at the docket. It looks like there's a status hearing in December, but I don't think they've
Yeah.
actually set sentencing. And it's possible they may push that off until he deals with his state charges too. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a status conference set for December 13th, but yeah, no sentencing date yet.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, this was interesting. It's such interesting times we live in, and I'm so glad that you and I can get together and talk about it in this
Yeah.
way. So before I sign off, let me remind our viewers / listeners, Mark can be found at sentencingstats.com. I, of course, can be found at setforsentencing.com or dougpassonlaw.com. Mark can also be found at zeropointoffender.com, 851amendment.com.
851amendment.com. Yes, that's good.
We got a lot of .coms, man.
Yes.
We should just boil these all down to one
Yes.
.com.
Yes.
But anyway, we're not hard to find. So thanks, man. I'll talk
Thank
to you
you.
very, very soon. Have a good
Okay.
rest of your weekend.
You too, man. Thank you.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.